I would like to talk to you today about the battle for Malta. The fight for this small island was critical for the whole North Africa campaign in the Second World War. On Malta, the survival of the British Empire depended, particularly its Mediterranean interests. We start with one of Norman Wilkinson's fine paintings from his War at Sea collection, held in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. While the battle for the island began in June 1940, this talk will focus on the critical years of 41 and 42. This was to be a bitter fight that would be a close-run thing. Between the start of the war and the end of November 1942, when the siege of Malta was finally lifted, 35 supply convoys were sent in to support the island and its 250,000 population. I should point out here that the Iron Navy is not an area I have researched heavily. Normally, I just focus on the 18th century. I therefore cannot claim to be an expert in this field. However, this talk was inspired by a family interest. My great-uncle, Ken Jellis, an 18-year-old merchant sailor, was on board one of the convoy ships, a Liberty ship called the William Wirt, in the North African campaign in late 1942. You see him sitting here underneath the after-deck gun on his ship in Gibraltar. This photo was taken by his brother, George, who was travelling out to Egypt while serving in the RAF. He was to be stationed hunting for U-boats. Sadly, Ken never saw the end of the war, and this was to be the last time his brother ever saw him. Ken was drowned off the coast of Newfoundland in 1944 in the wreck of the SS Empire Knight. Further inspiration was gained through a recent research project I ran for our village archive group in Grendon Underwood. I looked into the ships on which 3 seamen named on our village war memorial served. One of them, Joseph Percy Hearn, served on board the aircraft carrier HMS Eagle. It is to Ken and Percy that I dedicate this tale. We should start by considering the importance of Malta. The island sits in the middle of the Mediterranean, 1,145 nautical miles from Gibraltar and 1,006 nautical miles from Alexandria. These were the 2 principal bases for the Navy at the time. Malta's problem was that it was just 60 nautical miles from Sicily, and hence in easy range of enemy planes and fast naval units. However, if the island base could be sustained, it offered an excellent means of taking the fight to the enemy through the harassing of enemy convoys supplying the Axis army in North Africa. Without the island, the Mediterranean would have become closed to British shipping, essentially threatening the survival of Egypt and the Far East outposts of the Empire, themselves already under mounting pressure from the Japanese. The early phase of the war fell under the control of 2 key figures. Let us introduce the Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean, Admiral Andrew Cunningham, based principally in Alexandria and known amongst the fleet as ABC. He is now considered the best admiral the Royal Navy has produced since Nelson. Cunningham was supported at the Admiralty by his friend, the First Sea Lord, Admiral Dudley Pound. Together they devised the plans to ensure the island's survival and pushed through the daring and costly operations that we are to discuss. The first phase of the campaign to push through supplies to the island began in January 1941 and was known as Operation Excess. It ran 4 convoys through to the island, supported by Vice Admiral Sir James Somerville on board his flagship HMS Malaya and the ships of Force H. The operation was not without problems, with the loss of the cruiser HMS Southampton, which was hit by a bomb directly into the engine room. However, we have the voyage cards from one of the surviving merchant ships, the SS Essex, which safely reached Malta on the 6th of January. The second convoy on the 10th of January suffered further losses, with the damage to the aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious on her return to Gibraltar being the most serious. However, the westbound convoy from Alexandria managed to deliver 2 freighters, the Breconshire and the Clan Macaulay, on the 10th of January. The push through appears to have stirred up Axis powers, as on the 16th of January the major air assault against the island began. It is important to remember that more bombs were to fall on the island over the next few months than had fallen on London in the entire Blitz campaign. Ju-88 and 87 dive bombers pummeled Valletta's dock facilities and airfields. Over 3,000 bombing raids were launched against the island, dropping 6,700 tons of bombs. A brief turnaround in British fortunes was to follow in late March with Cunningham's masterstroke, the Battle of Matapan. Cunningham himself led the action on his flagship, the old Jutland veteran HMS Warspite. This old ship had been heavily modernised in 1937, and you can see here her Admiralty General Arrangement plans from this refit here. 3 Italian cruisers and 2 destroyers were lost, and the battleship Vittorio Veneto was seriously damaged, which essentially removed her threat for the next few months. However, the convoys that this action was to shield, known as Operation Lustre, only managed to get through 4 freighters to the island. May 1941 saw Cunningham's next push, that needed to get fuel as well as supplies through to the island. Operation Tiger saw 2 tankers and 4 freighters set out from Alexandria. The Royal Navy was to suffer great losses in pressing home this convoy, with the loss of the destroyers HMS Kelly, Juno, Greyhound and Kashmir, and the cruisers HMS Gloucester and Fiji. The Kelly, under the command of Lord Louis Mountbatten, was of course to act as the backdrop used for the Noel Coward and David Lean film In Which We Serve. The 27th of May saw a further blow to British fortunes with the withdrawal from Crete. Admiral Rawlings led the withdrawal from on board his flagship HMS Orion, and again the operation was well executed. However, the damage to the aircraft carrier HMS Formidable and the loss of 3 cruisers and 6 destroyers led to a further blow to ABC's dwindling resources. Summer brought some further respite to Malta, and the Navy, with the Germany's shift in focus towards the Russian campaign, Operation Substance saw 6 merchant ships run the gauntlet under the cover of the battle cruiser HMS Renown, and with the cruiser HMS Hermione and aircraft carrier Ark Royal. However, again, naval losses were sustained, with further damage to the cruiser HMS Manchester. This town-class light cruiser had been built in 1938. You can see her Admiralty General Arrangement plans here. The merchantman Sydney Star, that we can see here, was one of the successful ships to arrive in Grand Harbour. Operation Halbert followed in September 1941, with 9 merchantmen, all capable of maintaining speeds of 15 knots. This included the Dunedin Star. HMS Rodney and the Prince of Wales provided the lead cover, again with the support of the Ark Royal and Hermione. On the 8th of November 1941, Force K, led by HMS Aurora and Penelope, affectionately known as the Pepper Pot, led an audacious attack on the Axis Duisburg or Beta convoy that were supporting Rommel's forces in Africa. 5 Axis freighters and 2 tankers were successfully sunk, including the Minatitil. The next major blow to the Navy came on the 13th of November 1941 with the loss of Ark Royal. She was undertaking a Spitfire delivery run for Malta and was close to Gibraltar. She was torpedoed by U-81 under the command of Frederick Guggenberger. He was to be awarded the Knight's Cross by Hitler for his success. Guggenberger ended his career as a Contra-Admiral in the post-war German Navy and became Deputy Chief of Staff at NATO. This loss was quickly followed with the sinking of the Queen Elizabeth battleship HMS Barham. She was torpedoed by U-331 under the command of Hans Dietrich von Tiesenhausen off the Egyptian coast. Barham had been operating with the 1st Battle Squadron and 15th Cruiser Squadron and was hunting an Axis convoy at the time. 3 hits in close succession resulted in the old ship taking on a rapid list, and I'm sure most of you have seen the film footage taken from HMS Valiant of the subsequent explosion in one of her magazines. 862 men died, including her captain. One of her lucky survivors was her admiral, Vice Admiral Henry Pridham Whipple. These losses were to have a major impact on ABC's options. The next major push was to be the last effort of the year and became known as the First Battle of Sirte. The Navy could only field 3 cruisers and 8 destroyers under the command of Rear Admiral Philip Vian in HMS Naiad. These were to support 4 merchantmen, including the SS Breconshire, to supply Malta. Vian, facing 2 Italian battleships, executed an incredibly audacious and brave offensive manoeuvre, at the same time shielding the merchantmen behind a smoke screen. Once the Breconshire was safely past, Vian was able to withdraw. Sadly, the other 3 freighters in the convoy were lost. The incessant aerial bombing of Malta continued, and in February 1942, the destroyer HMS Maori was sunk at her moorings in Grand Harbour. 21st and 22nd of March saw Admiral Philip Vian repeat his audacious manoeuvring and shielding of the convoy in the Second Battle of Sirte. When HMS Naiad was hit, he shifted his flag to HMS Cleopatra. For those of you familiar with the Navy's training base, HMS Raleigh, you will recall HMS Havoc. This poor destroyer took a direct hit from a 15-inch shell from one of the Italian battleships. Despite a flooded boiler room, she managed to limp to Gibraltar. One of the merchantmen under escort, the SS Pampas, was sunk within the harbour by enemy aircraft. This was to be ABC's last role as Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean, as he moved on to take the role of Allied High Command with Eisenhower. His replacement was to be Henry Harwood, famous from his Battle of the River Plate exploits. His appointment was followed in April 1942 by King George VI taking the unusual step of awarding the whole island the George Cross Medal in recognition of the islanders' determined bravery in standing up to the continued onslaught of enemy bombing as the attack reached its zenith. On receipt of the award, Lieutenant General Sir William Dobbie replied on behalf of the whole island, "By God's help, Malta will not weaken, but will endure until victory is won." Brave words indeed. June 1942 was to be the next attempt to break through to the island with Operation Harpoon, bringing a convoy of 5 freighters and 1 oil tanker from Gibraltar, and Operation Vigorous, taking 11 freighters from Alexandria. At the same time, the Eagle, under the command of Captain Edmund Rushbrook, was tasked with flying in Spitfires to support the island. The Eagle was by this time an antiquated aircraft carrier, having been converted originally from a Chilean pre-First World War battleship. You can see her Admiralty General Arrangement plans here, taken from her last refit that had taken place back in 1924. Both Operation Harpoon and Vigorous were unlucky and failed in their objectives. Vigorous had to turn back due to a shortage of ammunition from incessant air attack and sea, and to add to the gloom, HMS Hermione was lost. The only light was that Eagle successfully delivered her Spitfires and 2 merchantmen got through to provide some brief relief. In all, Eagle successfully delivered 172 Spitfires to Malta over 8 different trips between March and July 1942. In doing so, she effectively saved the island. The failures of Harpoon and Vigorous needed a return to the drawing board and a rethink of operational planning. The result of the hard work at the Admiralty was to become known as Convoy WS-21S, otherwise known as Operation Pedestal. The aim was to use high-speed freighters and a modern oil tanker, 14 merchantmen and the famous tanker Ohio, under the command of Captain Dudley Mason. They were gathered at Gibraltar. To support them, the Navy drafted in a huge escort led by HMS Nelson, the flagship of Admiral Neville Siffret. She was joined by HMS Rodney and 4 aircraft carriers, HMS Victorious under Admiral Arthur Lister, HMS Indomitable under Admiral Dennis Boyd, HMS Eagle and the Furious. Her cruiser force, consisting of HMS Phoebe, Sirius and Charybdis, and 15 destroyers, was to be supported by Force X, commanded by Admiral Harold Burrow in his cruiser HMS Nigeria. He was supported by the Manchester, Kenya and Cairo, with a further 11 destroyers. The fleet left Gibraltar on the 10th of August 1942. Eagle's fate was quickly sealed as the very next day a U-boat successfully broke through the destroyer screen. The young telegraphist aboard the Eagle appears to have suspected something was not right. Sadly, his superiors did not take his concerns seriously. The U-73, under the command of Helmut Rosenbaum, fired 4 torpedoes at Eagle. The old ship was hit and quickly listed to port. We have the account of a survivor from the ship's engine room, Lieutenant Derek Walling. He was serving as an engine room artificer. He writes, "I was checking electrical distribution boxes in the port wing engine room when we were torpedoed, and I consider my escape to be nothing short of miraculous. We were being tracked by enemy submarines, and the Eagle was the first ship to be torpedoed. She went down in just 8 minutes. I spent all 8 minutes trying to escape before the ship sank, and I was only 50 yards away from her when she turned over. After helping about 6 shipmates to reach an open hatch from which the ladder had fallen, by allowing them to climb up on my back, I was left trapped inside the ship. I could not see anything because it was pitch black, and I had to feel my way around in the smoke. I was close to giving up. It seemed impossible. Then I thought of my parents and prayed, 'Oh God, help me.' And in the last minute or two, I found my way out of the engine room. Once up on the high side, I knew that the nearest place out of the ship was through the boiler room air intakes. As I got there, the stoker came up from the boiler room mad with fear and tried to get me to go back down into the ship. Somehow I got him to help me open the hatch, pushed him up, and thankfully he helped me up too. But I still had to shove him over the side of the ship to safety, as he was still convinced he should go the other way. Without the stoker, I would not be here. We needed each other. I was covered in oil when I was scooped to safety aboard the destroyer Laforet. Clearly a terrifying ordeal. Sadly, 130 of his shipmates rest in peace at the bottom of the sea. 67 officers and 862 crew were picked up by the destroyers Laforet, Venomous and Lookout. U-73 and her commander, Helmut Rosenbaum, had been notably successful. This boat was responsible for the loss of 8 merchant ships and 3 warships, including Eagle. The boat was fated upon her safe arrival back at base, and the commander received the Knight's Cross for the sinking. The next casualty was to be HMS Furious, receiving a torpedo hit in the bow. However, she managed to retreat back to Gibraltar. Indomitable was next, taking a bomb hit on the deck that killed 72 men. A day later, she was hit again with a bomb on the forward lift of the flight deck. A further 44 men were killed and 59 wounded. She, like Furious before her, retreated back to Gibraltar. Despite Eagle's loss and the departure of 2 other aircraft carriers, the convoy continued. HMS Cairo was next to be hit, and she sank by the stern with the same attack, leading to a direct hit on the Ohio. This resulted in a massive fire. The fire extinguished, the wounded tanker struggled on. She was next to suffer a direct hit when an out-of-control Stuka dive bomber hit her side and bounced off into the sea, causing another blaze of aviation fuel. The light cruiser Manchester had to be scuttled due to her damage, and the destroyer Foresight was also lost. However, the cruisers HMS Kenya and Nigeria, both virtual wrecks, lived to fight another day, with Admiral Burrow transferring his flag from Nigeria to the destroyer HMS Ashanti for the remainder of the operation. In all, 9 merchant ships were lost. But once again, the efforts of the Royal Navy were not in vain. The remaining convoys struggled on, with 4 of the freighters, including the badly damaged Rochester Castle, Melbourne Star, and the vital Ohio, the final ship to arrive in Grand Harbour. All of the ships were damaged, but Ohio had been so heavily bombed that she was dead in the water. Her situation was so bad that she had to be strapped to 2 destroyers to keep her afloat and get her into the harbour. She would never sail again, but the unburnt remains of her 11,000-ton fuel cargo had arrived, along with around 29,000 tons of cargo and supplies. After Pedestal, the scenario in the Mediterranean changed. Rommel's defeat at El Alamein and the drain of Axis resources in Russia meant that Malta had been saved. In September, with the arrival of the Santa Maria convoy, a public ceremony was held to recognise the islanders' bravery award from the King. By November, the siege of Malta was over. Overall, the Allies had lost 231 merchantmen in the Mediterranean, totalling 866,490 gross tons of shipping in 1941 and 42. The British had lost 76 warships and 48 submarines, all sunk in the Mediterranean trying to protect them. The Italians lost 83 warships and 84 submarines, with Germany losing 68 submarines. The cost of lives and men cannot be understated, and all to ensure the survival of a tiny little plucky island. I leave you, as we had begun, with one of Norman Wilkinson's fine paintings. This one is of the battered Ohio, approaching her final berth. And finally, to finish, a beautiful picture I took sailing into Grand Harbour's entrance in Valletta a fine haven indeed. Thank you for listening.